Good morning, everyone. We're going to look at the work by C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man, together over the next 3 hours. I'm going to look at it in 3 parts since it was delivered as 3 separate lectures initially. Just for the case of historical context, the book appeared in 1943, and it was in response to a book that was circulating and was being used at that time in high schools, which Lewis calls the Green Book. He cites its authors as Gaius and Titius, and that's just a way of disguising the names of the identity of the authors, because he didn't want it to be seen as a personal attack on these men. Their names are Alec King and Martin Ketley. But it was a real book, and it was circulating at the time, and Lewis was disturbed by what he saw in it. And so what we see here in this episode of your course on Christ and culture is an engagement with the field of education, but education taken in a, I suspect, much broader scope than one would normally expect to see in treatises on education. I believe this is one of the great books of the 20th century. I think it's essential reading. It was essential reading when it was written. It remains essential reading today for many of the same reasons. And as I say, I'll deal with it in 3 separate talks here, dealing with the 3 distinct chapters, beginning with Man Without Chests, the first chapter. But this is a defense. If you read the Wikipedia entry or most treatments of it, they will see it as a defense of objective value and of natural law. I think that's partly true, and I think there's also somewhat more to it than that. And that becomes apparent as we go from the first chapter, which is dealing with that, and the second chapter, which is dealing with that, to the consequences of removing that, which is replacing with something else. And that will be in the chapter that we call The Abolition of Man, the 3rd of the 3 chapters. And we will see something that today we would call transhumanism being advanced in its place. And scientism, which is a phrase that we ought to be acquainted with after the last 2 years of lockdown. But if you're not, then we will discuss that in the 3rd of the 3 installments. But this is subtitled, this book, The Abolition of Man, is Reflections on Education with Special Reference to the Teaching of English in the Upper Forms of Schools. Now, for those of you who are not studying English literature as your major, you pitiable souls, English is considered to be an important subject. Not just considered by me, but considered by many, because it is in the school of rhetoric, and it is dealing with truth as it presents itself to us in a form of that appeals to our sensibilities, our moral sensibilities, our aesthetic sensibilities, and involves the whole person. It draws us in through story. Note that the Bible itself is written in the form primarily of narrative. Where it's not written in narrative, it tends to present itself to us in poetry. There are very few passages in scripture that would present themselves to us in the form that philosophers would recognize, and that is in the terms of propositions. And that's not because it doesn't contain propositional truth. It does, of course, contain propositional truth that we can understand and defend. But it appeals to us in accordance with how human beings traditionally, across all cultures, have best responded to the form of truth, and that is namely to their sense of story and being part of a plan, a grand narrative, if you will. And Lewis himself is a great storyteller, as we know if you've read the Narnia Chronicles or his science fiction trilogy. And if you haven't, and you're around next year, I'm teaching that in my sci-fi and sub-creation course. But he is at pains to deal with something that's very different in his day than anything that had preceded his age. And it's something that we are still struggling with to this day. And it is what he calls the abolition of man. And what does he mean by this? I want to backtrack a little bit before I deal specifically with the first chapter, Men Without Chests. I'll have enough time to deal with that. But this is a little introduction here, shall we say. And what I want to draw your attention to, first of all, is a lecture that he gave, not when he was at Oxford, but when he was at Cambridge. I believe it was in 1954, when he was finally given a professor's chair at Cambridge. He'd been denied it at Oxford for various political reasons. But he did receive the offer at Cambridge, and the offer was one that was constructed for him. The chair was. It had Lewis in mind when it was established, and it was the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature, which to that point had not existed. You were a medievalist, you were a Renaissance scholar. Lewis was both. And I think he's able as both, quite frankly. And so Lewis, in his inaugural lecture, deals with the issues that come to some degree prompted by this connection of two what are often seen as discrete periods of literature, namely the medieval and the Renaissance period. And he needs to do that because there is a certain conception out there, which he deals with in his lecture, about the medieval period, often calling it the Dark Ages, and describing it in terms of various irrationality and superstition and magic and so forth, which Lewis tells us largely come from the Enlightenment, this disparagement of the medieval period, even though he might have noted that the university, that institution that we operate in here in this class, did not exist in the ancient world. And it came into existence right in the middle of the High Middle Ages, or the beginning of the High Middle Ages. And so it is a medieval Christian institution. It, although the ancient world was certainly interested in knowledge, and we owe our terminology and many of our foundations to the classical era, it's only in the medieval period that a sense of the university established itself. And with that, connections of that with Christian theology, because what the university does is it connects two things that the ancient world found impossible to connect, namely our perception of the idea that ultimate reality is unified on the one hand, and that it is multiplicitous on the other. It has multiple forms. So in terms of the unity of all things, well, when we appeal to concepts like justice and truth and goodness and beauty, we're appealing to ideas that unify things, which we think we can describe all things and judge them in accordance with that. That's a unifying concept, or being. Whereas when we talk about multiplicity or the many, we're talking about the fact that when we perceive reality, we see many, many different things, and they don't seem to be reducible to one thing. They have multiplicity about them. There are many different forms, just as we are different persons. And a chair is not a lamp or a table. These are different objects. So how do we account for the fact that we appeal to the unity of all things when we appeal to concepts of justice and beauty and goodness and truth and being? And yet at the same time, we do think that there are real diverse forms. Well, it's the problem of the one and the many, and the philosophers of the ancient world couldn't solve it. But in the Christian university, it was tackled and I believe solved in the discussions of the Trinity. Remember, God is one and also three. And these are equally ultimate. He is one. There is only one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. It says in the Torah. And in terms of his personhood, there is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, each of which is God, and all of whom are God. So is the Trinity, the mystery of the three and the one. And that is the way in which the university is tackling this problem that evaded that of the ancient world. There are other issues that arise in the medieval university, the notion of realism versus nominalism. I'm not going to get into all that because Lewis isn't interested in that. What he is interested in, and what he advances in the first chapter, is the fact that there is an unbroken approach and understanding of human nature that reigns all the way up until sometime in the mid-19th century. And in that inaugural lecture, which he gave the Latin title De Descriptione Temporum, he talks about different ages and where the dividing line would fall. Some think the modern period begins with Descartes. Lewis agrees that if we were to describe it intellectually and just describing the history of thought in a narrow sense, that he would draw the line there too. But when it comes to describing culture in general, and here we're talking about Christianity and culture, there's other changes that need to be brought into mind. And the first of these is that science, as it was applied by the Royal Society in the 1680s, was used to describe the natural world, the scientific method. It described the created order, and the tone of the discourse was ethical and rhetorical and juristic, and it wasn't scientific. And so the men who wrote in philosophy or in science often sounded like gentlemen, and they conducted themselves that way. But come the mid-19th century, and I'll quote Lewis here, he says, science was not the business of man because man had not yet become the business of science. So up until this period, science was studied by a few gentlemen, but it wasn't considered to be big business. Hadn't been given the funding of research. Whole countries didn't stand behind research agencies. That was about to change because, as he says, science was not the business of man because man had not become the business of science. It chiefly dealt with the inanimate. It threw off a few technological byproducts. But then there's a change. When Watt makes his engine, when Darwin starts monkeying around with the ancestry of man, and Freud with his soul, and the economists with all that is his, then indeed the lion will have got out of its cage. Whereas up till that point, he says the sciences remained like a lion cub whose gambols delighted its master in private. They had not yet tasted man's blood. And here is the shift, that this does indeed take place. They taste man's blood. And so the abolition of man, to some degree, paradoxically, but it's certainly noteworthy whether it's a paradox or not. The abolition of man begins when we study mankind as a subject or as an object of our investigations. In other words, we turn science upon ourselves. We look at ourselves as a human subject, and we do experiments on human beings. At that point, there's a shift that takes place, and it's a very odd sort of shift. And he says that what describes this better than anything else is the move towards the machine. He says it's the onset of the birth of the machines in the mid-19th century that changes the trajectory before, which had been unbroken from the ancient world, from the time of the Bible, through the classical era, through the advent of Christianity, and even through the Renaissance and even through the Enlightenment. Up until that point, they shared a common view of human nature, and that it was unchanging and could not be changed and ought not to be changed. In fact, it was what it was. And the definition of what human nature was clarified under Christian teaching in accordance with the idea that we see in Genesis 1:26, that we are made in the image of God, in imago Dei. And so because of that, we advance ideas like the sanctity of human life, not of life as a whole, but even individually, that an individual bears the image of God, and therefore we may not do with that person what we would like to do. That's all the way. It's not even there. We don't even have to go to the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not kill. You can see it in Genesis 9 verses 1-4, where that's the reason for the prohibition against taking human life, is that God formed man in his own image, and therefore you may not just take life. You may not do with a person. So there's a restraint on the human interaction with other human beings. It's a prohibition. It's a bright red line there. But once we get to the idea of machines, Lewis notes that it alters our place in nature. And he says that it has all sorts of effects. And one of them is that we measure progress by the advent of new machines. And to some degree, we have birthdays, of course, just as men have since time immemorial. We get a year older, but we often think of our time in terms of rites of passage or even instruments that we use. So we remember when we got our first iPhone, perhaps, or we first got when the internet evolved. These are markers, and they change the way we think about things. And Lewis comments, he says, in the ages past, things like marriage and the births of their children were the markers of their lives, the milestones. When now we have technical advances. He says, from the old push bike to the motorbike, and that's the little car, from the gramophone to the radio, from the radio to television, from the range to the stove. He says these are aspects of a human pilgrimage and markers of what we believe is progress. And so we identify ourselves with the technology, but the technology also changes us. And we start to see ourselves in conformity with the machines that we love and we think serve us. We may find, in fact, that we serve them. And there's a lot of things written on this. I will, in the next installment, bring you a book that I think you might find interesting that says more about that topic. But he says that everything that we do at this point is provisional, and it's going to be superseded by something better, by the attainment of goods that we have not ever had. And so rather than preserve and conserve the human experience, we are all too ready to dispense with it and move on to something newer and better, which we assume is coming up the road. And so we're not wanting to protect institutions. We're not wanting to hold on to perennial human goods, particularly the perennial human good of the sanctity of human life from time immemorial. And we're willing to sacrifice that to something that what Lewis calls the conditioners, those who promise this progress, say is going to be better than what we already have. So we're willing to sacrifice ourselves to the idol of progress, in other words. And the book begins, and the first chapter begins, and again, I call it this by its title, Men Without Chests, with this reference to chests. And if you've read the book, which I trust that you have, it's not a long book, but it is a meaty book, and it is one that is worthy of reading and rereading, unlike many books that we read. There's this famous quote in it that we make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. This is the phrase that, to me, summarizes the whole of the first chapter. And it's what he sees as wrong with the current education system. From time immemorial, education, he goes on to explain to us, has been predicated on the idea that human beings not only have a biological, what we would call biological, physical nature, which is the same for each and every person, but also have a moral nature, which is the same for each and every person. Not that we're all equally the same in our moral actions. That changes in accordance with our capacity to act, in accordance with our freedom of will to do this or do that. So we can do different moral actions, but we have the same moral standards. And this is what he's going to call the Tao, T-A-O. That'll be the title of the second chapter. We'll get to that when we get to it. But this sentence that we make men without chests, when he says that we make men, what he means by this is we educate them to be without chests. And I'm going to dig down on that and explain what he means by it. But let me begin with the beginning here. And he begins with a little anecdote. And he talks about this book by Gaius Anticius in the second chapter thereof. And they quote a well-known story of Coleridge at the waterfall, two tourists present. One calls it sublime, the other calls it pretty. And Coleridge endorses the first judgment. It's sublime. It's not just pretty. And the commentators, the educators, the authors of the Green Book, Gaius and Titius, comment as follows. When the man said this is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was, really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Now, Lewis's comment that here are a good many deep questions settled in a pretty summary fashion, but the authors are not yet finished. They add, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we're only saying something about our own feelings. We are only saying something important about our feelings. So note that they are dismissing the predication of aesthetic value here, the judgment whether it's sublime or whether it's just merely pretty. Coleridge thinks that it's sublime, and he thinks it's important that we can distinguish between sublimity and prettiness, in accordance with sublimity being a much higher predication of aesthetic value. It's the most beautiful thing is the sublime, whereas the prettiness is just a lower assessment. It's not that it's unattractive, but still. But the authors say that it's only about this. It doesn't really matter what we do here. And here comes the divide, which to my knowledge first was brought to the attention of the philosophical world by David Hume, who created what we call the fact-value distinction. And to refresh your memories or to acquaint you with something you've not yet heard, Hume claims that we can make scientific statements about matters of fact, and we can hold these to be objectively true. However, when it comes to value judgments, evaluations of things, we're making subjective assertions that we cannot claim have any objective value. And under that value judgment will include matters of religious conviction, expressions of faith, expressions of moral judgment, expressions of aesthetic judgment. Hume will dismiss these as value judgments, but they never attain to objectivity. They never get to the point of being things that we ought to do. And with this, Hume is debunking a long-standing tradition that will uphold, as I said at the outset, the idea that we have an objective moral nature, and that standards of justice are standards of justice, just that, just like there are standards of truth and logic and of beauty and of goodness and so forth. And Lewis will talk about this a great deal, and he uses the same sort of defense that he's putting out here in his book, Mere Christianity, which begins with a definition of justice. And a defense of this. The idea, which is the law of human nature, as Lewis describes it, or if you prefer, a rule about right and wrong, which Lewis says is available to all and known by all people, and they know it intuitively from an early age. So children will argue with one another and say to one another when they do something that they perceive to be wrong, that's not fair. That's not fair. When they say that's not fair, what they mean by that is that the other person that they say that to, they understands what fairness is. They don't have to explain it to them. They assume it's so abundantly obvious that they are simply saying, stop. And we all know about this, and we see children do it, and then they will argue about it. But what they don't argue about is that that fairness is a legitimate concept. They know that it's objectively valid, and they appeal to it whenever it is acted against them. When they suffer injustice, they appeal to this. When they're the ones who are doing the injustice, they'll say, well, it doesn't really apply here or here, and then they'll give a reason for this. In Mere Christianity, Lewis says, the law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. They did not mean, of course, that you could not find an odd individual here and there who did not know it, just as you find a few people who are colorblind or have no ear for a tune. But taking the human race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. And I believe they were right. And if they were not, Lewis says, then all the things we said about the war, and he's writing Mere Christianity right after the war, were nonsense. What was the sense in saying the enemy were in the wrong unless right is a real thing, which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced, but didn't. If they had no notion of what we mean by right, then, though we might still have had to fight them, we could no more have blamed them for that than for the color of their hair. But we do think that they knew what was right and wrong, and they just simply didn't do it. Now, this is the establishment in the Abolition of Man, in Men Without Chests, of the legitimacy of the law of nature, that there is such a thing as objective moral value. And what he's going to do through this chapter is to trace how this law of human nature has been discussed by Christians and also by classical authors for ages. And they will all be in agreement. It's a universal agreement. And he's going to demonstrate that in chapter 2. He'll go to various religions to demonstrate this as well. And it's not, as Gaius and Titius present it to us, a matter of dismissal, as if it were merely subjective, as if it were a matter on which we didn't need to come to an agreement, because it's abundantly clear that we do need to appeal to fairness. We do need to appeal to right and wrong, and we always do. So they have come at it the wrong way, and they are educators, so they should know better. And he says the danger of the approach that they've taken. So remember, he says that they're only saying something about their own feelings. Lewis objects to this word "only" here. They are saying something about their feelings, but they're saying that their feelings are legitimate and objective and correct. And they're going to argue about this. And the illustration I always use here to Christians is in the worship wars. You may be on the other side of it, but there was a time in churches when hymns were sung in churches, and mostly almost only hymns. At one point in various churches, this changed, and there was new worship lyrics were brought in. In some churches, it's always new worship lyrics. And there was a pushback against this. And some said, we ought not to disagree over these small trivial matters, but others dug their heels in and said, no, I think we ought not to do that. We ought to hold on to this because it's good and true and beautiful. On both sides, there was intransigence. There was an unwillingness to compromise. Churches split over it. Some think that that's unfortunate, me included, but it's understandable. And it's understandable because what is being fought over is the objective value of beauty. That's what people are fighting over, and being unwilling to compromise. They think that there's something very real at stake here. These songs are reverent. These songs are lively. These songs are stodgy. These songs are trivial. You'll hear it back and forth on either side. In both cases, they are acting as if aesthetic judgments were things we ought not to compromise on. And so they are again appealing to the Tao. Which one is right and which one's wrong, I'm not even interested in discussing here. I have my own clear views on the matter, but that would distract me from the point here. It's not only about our own feelings. It's about something more important than that. It's very important to us, and music is very important to us. I trust you will agree with me on that. I will say furthermore, just on that point, before I get distracted and move on with the argument, Plato says in his work, The Laws, that if you wish to destroy a nation, you change its music. That's a very interesting thing as well, because he connects the beauty in the music with an order, with an unchangeable order. He doesn't think that progress can be made in music. He would find musical transformations puzzling and probably a sign of serious problems. But back to the book here, he says, Lewis says, the schoolboy who reads this passage in the Green Book, that my feelings are only a subjective matter, will conclude that my feelings are contemptible. I don't need to concern myself with feelings at all. And he says, if the schoolboy who reads this passage in the Green Book will believe two propositions. Firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. And secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. Doesn't matter, they don't matter. And with this, they will dismiss the whole of their culture. Almost every human achievement can be expressed in song, in narrative. These are then to be dismissed as merely subjective things. And this is what I often hear from people when they hear that I'm teaching literature or poetry, even worse, that I'm dealing with matters of merely subjective value, but not really dealing with anything particularly important, which of course we would be getting if we were, say, in Christian circles studying the Bible. I think that they're both important, quite frankly. But certainly in response to a scientist will say that I deal with objective facts, I do science, I do things that can be considered knowledge, whereas what you do is something a little bit less substantial and a little less important. Lewis disagrees, so do I, and so should you. Because we all appeal to ideas of goodness, beauty, justice, truth, being, evil, good, etc. These things are necessary for us. We can't prove these things, by the way, in a scientific lab. These are not something can be demonstrated by that, but they're essential to our operation as moral beings in the world and to our beings as bearers of the Imago Dei. Remember, God says that we ought not to kill. You must not kill. It's a prohibition. It's a moral injunction. Remember, God speaks to Adam and Eve and he commands them. He assumes that they understand what he is saying, firstly, and secondly, he orders them. He gives them moral judgments. And there's imperatives that come with the imperative sense in any language. So something very important is happening here, and Lewis wants to dig down on that. I'm going to skip over some of that, but I'm going to come to the passage in which he talks about this, about men without chests. And what he discusses here is a so-called Tao of sentiment. I think we can talk about this. There's an underlying nature to the world, and we can make truthful statements about that reality. So it's a doctrine of objective value in relation to morality and in relation to beauty, in relation to politics, in relation above all to human nature. So we are the same sorts of things we can teach as a science, ethics. We can teach as a science, politics. Why? Because human beings are human beings. And Lewis thinks that that is best described by this word, the Tao. And he says that until recently, until modern times, all teachers and even all men believe the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, or our reverence or our contempt. So some things we aren't merely disgusted by, but deserve to be the objects of our disgust. Note that our emotions then attain a validity and they're appropriate. And not only are they appropriate, they're required. We ought to get angry about certain things. We ought to feel admiration at certain things. We ought to be inspired to courage by certain things. So since things of value are objective, they will elicit from this. So for example, the night sky should elicit a feeling of humility. We look up and feel small in comparison. When we read a story or watch a movie about a courageous warrior, we ought to feel a sense of veneration. When we see little children playing, we ought to feel senses of delight. When a friend's father dies, we ought to feel sympathy. When somebody acts kindly, we ought to feel grateful. We ought to. That is the way things are. If we don't do that, we aren't merely disagreeing. Our subjective feelings are not of no importance. They are a sign that we are rejecting the law of nature over us. And these things come emotionally and to some degree automatically. And so the argument is going to go by Lewis here that the emotions and the feelings need to be trained and in harmony with that nature. We all from early childhood understand that there is such a thing as justice, but we need to be trained to feel the right feelings in the right context, and the context matters. We ought to be able to respect our fellow human beings. We ought to reverence our parents. We ought to obey our teachers, etc., etc. And they ought to treat us appropriately in accordance with their station in life as well. But there's a training that takes place, and it teaches us to evaluate whether things are more or less just, or more or less true, more or less beautiful, more or less good, in proportion to the feelings that we have that come with them. And we ought to feel those. So we ought to be trained to feel those feelings. Feelings don't just come to us naturally, and reasoning come to us by laborious process. Both are a process. And St. Augustine addresses this, and he describes virtue by the phrase ordo amoris, an order of love, and or as Lewis describes it, the ordinate condition of the affections, in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. In modern education, we avoid those sentiments. We avoid strong senses of hatred. We avoid strong senses of love. We avoid strong senses of disgust. Everything is something to be tolerated. We receive all things with inclusion. We receive all things as simply diverse and not right or wrong. We use the concept of equity to justify this, but what the concept of equity is, it flattens down the differences between right and wrong as if they were just two subjective experiences, as opposed to one being right and the other being wrong, and not only different, but actually opposed to one another. Now, our education system is affected by this. So if you scoff at brave men and you decide you're not going to go to a friend's funeral because it's too much work for you, if you aren't thankful when somebody gives you a gift, it shows you that you are lacking in your sentiments. You've not been trained to do the right thing even though you don't want to, because it's right. So your feelings need to be trained. And Lewis comments that in his day, he notices of students that they're not bad students. They're not like jungles. They're not like a garden of weeds. He describes them as being like deserts. They need to be watered. They've never been acquainted with greatness. They've never been taught to feel the right things. And this is the fault of the education system, says Lewis. And I think his comments about the education in his day could apply just as much to our day. And he says this: because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective order, therefore emotional states can be in harmony with reason when we feel liking for what we ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason when we perceive that liking is due but can't feel it. No emotion is in itself a judgment. In that sense, all emotions and sentiments are alogical. They don't belong under the category of logic at all, but they can be reasonable or unreasonable as they conform to reason or they fail to conform. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. Okay. So he says that really what we need to do as a defense against the propaganda that is characteristic of the modern education system is to oppose the false sentiments that the conditioners are conditioning into us with just sentiments. We need to get people to feel the right things in the right situations, to resist propaganda. Remember, he's writing in 1943 while the Nazi propaganda assault is being is controlling the populace of Germany. Just as we've seen in the last few years, there's been a propaganda assault in Canada and in other nations under COVID. There's been no discussion of science. There's been appeals to science without any scientific debate. There's been no sentiment of questioning of whether these measures taken are legitimate. There's been no discussion whatsoever. It's just been safe and it's been good. Why? Because we say so. So Lewis observes here that without trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. And this is what he says is the real problem. We have created men without chests. And chests are not only an aspect of education, he thinks that it is the most important aspect of education. So I'll read this to you. He said, "I'd sooner play cards against a man who was quite skeptical about ethics, but bred to believe that a gentleman does not cheat, than against an irreproachable moral philosopher who had been brought up among sharpers, who'd been brought up to cheat. In battle, it is not logical syllogisms that will keep the reluctant nerves and muscles to their post in the third hour of the bombardment. The crudest sentimentalism about a flag or a country or a regiment will be of more use." So the feelings often trump the head. Now, Lewis notes this, and so does the whole of the field of education up to this point. So the moral sentiments of mankind, the aesthetic sensibilities which we teach, if we neglect, make us more and more susceptible to propaganda. And this is a serious problem in Lewis's day. It remains a serious problem in our day. And this introduces brings us to the idea that Lewis advances here about the difference between the old school of education and the new school. In the old school, the teacher was a model for the student. You were supposed to follow in the footsteps of the teacher, and you would do what the teacher did. Jesus tells us to follow him. The Apostle Paul tells us to imitate his life and imitate his doctrine. Well, his life and his doctrine are tuned by his own discipleship in following Christ, which is the way of the cross. That is how the old people, the old school of education worked. The old initiated you into a form of life, whereas the new form of education, Lewis will present as an antithesis, it conditions us. So I'll read from the passage. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as the poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus or thus for purposes of which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. So what is the solution to this then in terms of education? Well, he moves on to the idea, and I think it's very important, called the allegory of the chariot. He presents this, I think, about 5 pages from the end. No, maybe more than that, when he talks about the tripartite soul. And he gives appeals to something from Plato's Phaedrus. And he describes this in a story, as Plato often does, and there's a chariot, there's a white horse, and there's a dark horse. Now, these are symbolic. What do they represent? Well, the chariot represents, or rather the charioteer, the man riding the chariot, represents the reason. The dark horse that it is, the man is driving on, represents his appetites, and the white horse, his thumos. Now, I'll explore what thumos is, but thumos, roughly speaking, is the seat of emotion, often associated with angry. When you are angered at injustice, or you're angry at yourself for not doing the right thing, it pushes you to it. It's a motivation. It's regularly invoked in the Odyssey and the Iliad, the thumos. It pushes you to do something. It motivates you. It causes you to act. That's your thumos. And that's what is represented by the white horse. And the white horse, it is an obedience to reason, total obedience. And the gods, the immortals, have two white horses, and they always go upwards and follow and do the right things. The wrong horse, the dark horse, that which represents the appetites, pulls downwards. It pulls us down in the wrong direction. The dark horse loves gain. The white horse loves victory. Aristotle describes it a little differently. He refers to these as the contemplative, the hedonistic, and the political aspects of our nature. And the Greeks see these as three almost independent entities within us, a real force, the way we ought to see ourselves. And the job of reasoning is to come to the aid of our thumos, our appetite, not our appetite, our sense of justice, which directs us. It tells us what the best thing to do is and pushes us to do the right thing. And when we fail to do it, it gets angry. And when somebody contradicts it, we get angry. And we have to be trained, the horses have to be trained to work towards those aims. Now, as the charioteer, the person, the reason is guiding those horses on where to go. And to do that well, though, you have to understand the nature of the two horses. Now, you could just unhitch one of the horses, but that's not going to, you're not going to get anywhere with that, because you have the two horses as a part of you. And Plato argues that the best part, which is the charioteer, is naturally weak in a man, so it can't govern the horses. And it itself needs to be trained. Reason needs to be trained. Philosophy does that very well. And you need harmony there. So rather than a civil war between the white and the dark horses, you need to play them off against one another, or rather to achieve a sort of harmony there. And how does this happen? And I'll quote Plato from the Phaedrus. You need to gain a harmony in your soul. How do you get this? Well, having first attained to self-mastery and beautiful order within himself, and having harmonized these three principles, the notes or intervals of three terms, quite literally the lowest and the highest, and the mean in between, and all others that may be between them, having linked and bound all three together and made of himself a unit, one man instead of many, self-controlled and in unison, he should then, and then only, turn to practice if he ought to do either in the getting of wealth or the tenets of the body, or it may be in political action or private business. In all things, believing and naming the just and honorable action to be that which preserves and helps to produce this condition of the soul. And you're going to gain mastery over that. So you have to train the horses. Well, what is the dark horse? Well, I talked about this as the passions. What does it do? Well, it pulls you towards things like money and sex and food and drink, not power per se, but the appetites. And this is a hard horse to train, because they pull us. When we're hungry, it's hard to resist a sense of hunger. And we need to find a way of attaining moderation there. We can let the appetites run wild, and then we just become a hedonist. We just eat everything that comes in front of us and indulge ourselves, become gluttonous. On the other hand, we could just try and starve ourselves and gain mastery over it that way. Well, that would make us ignore the dark horse and its legitimate needs. Rather, we ought to be trained to take delight in tastes and our appetites. We ought to enjoy sex. We ought to enjoy good food. We ought to dislike certain other types of foods. If we just simply indulge ourselves, Aristotle calls us that life bovine. We're like the cows. And we're enslaving the divine part of ourselves, our reason, to the least admirable part. And we deem such people to be wretched. But we ought to find a sort of middle ground there. And we ought to train our appetites, even the dark horse, to a path of moderation so that it can be pulled by the white horse. And when it does so, by the way, on the charioteer, it goes upwards to behold the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the just. And when it sees these forms, the longer it's in proximity to them, the more it's able to make a circle around the earth. If it doesn't have enough, it crashes down to the earth and so forth. If it stays up there, then you can come around once again, and you're gaining and you're improving yourself. And so there is a sense of moral improvement that comes with training the passions and makes you want to do the right thing because it is right. That's more or less what I would like to say about this episode here in Men Without Chests. The chest is not just the passions, it is the inner person. It includes the passions. The passions must not be dismissed as being irrelevant. Otherwise, we are laying ourselves prey to propaganda, which plays upon our emotions, doesn't allow our reason to adjudicate, and makes us not feel disgust when we're being told lies. Makes us approve of things which ought to be condemned as hateful. That'll be it for this one, and I'll pick it up next time when we discuss the Tao.